Do you ever wonder how grandmasters are able to evaluate so many different types of positions so quickly and so accurately? Watch this video and I will teach you the overall methodology that we follow. Today I'm going to teach you how to evaluate positions in chess. The ideas I'm going to show you apply to one type of position, but you can use the same philosophy in order to expand your chess knowledge massively. The key idea that I want to convey is that chess players at the master or even grandmaster level don't learn to evaluate every position. They just learn a few positions very well, and then they just apply little adjustments when they want to evaluate a similar position. I'm going to start by showing you a couple of what I call canonical wins. These are wins that is basically a winning method that works every time once certain conditions are on the board. Let's look at the position we have on the board. The first thing I want you to notice is that we have a very strong knight on d5. This is a perfect outpost. It is an outpost because the knight is in a central square, it is supported by a pawn, but more importantly, nobody can drive this knight away. Look at the position of, look at the location of black's pawns on e5 and d6. The pawn on e5 cannot go back to e6 to bother this knight. The pawn on d6 is what we call a backward pawn. It is a pawn that doesn't have any support and it is on an open file. So this is actually a very common combination. I want you to notice these pieces. Pawn on e4, knight on d5. This is good. Then pawn on e5, pawn on d6. This is bad. And then we have a semi-open file, and then there is some pressure on the pawn. If you have these 5 pieces where they are, then this is typically an advantage for white, because there is this eternal pressure against the pawn on d6. There is this very powerful knight that is always doing annoying things to the opponent. So when we look at this position, we already know with white we must be at least doing okay. Then there is some additional factor. I want you to notice the pawn, the bishop on e7. It's funny that I almost call it a pawn because actually it is almost a pawn in this game. It is doing virtually nothing. And then the final thing I want you to notice is that there are many pieces on the board, means there is a lot of resources, a lot of ideas, and there are no flaws in white's position. Look at the king, for example, perfectly covered by the pawns near it. And then we have a queenside where we have some very standard ideas that I'm going to show you in just a moment. You may look at this and think white is a little bit better, but I'm going to tell you actually that if you know this position well, you know that this is already a decisive advantage for white. Let me show you the winning method. The first move is b4. We play this move partially to fixate the pawn on b5, make sure that it cannot go anywhere, and next we're going to attack it. There's a lot of ways that our opponent could try to defend, but none of them work. For example, if we play rook b8, then we can respond with a4, then trade. Now this pawn on b5 is already looking weak, so we can play rook a5 next, adding pressure. Then the opponent can just maybe try to rearrange their pieces in order to defend this pawn, trying to defend it with everything. But next, we can just keep increasing the pressure. Before I do that, I'm just going to make a couple of useful moves. I'm going to play g3 and king g2. You will see these moves a lot. They're very standard. They do nothing. They just make sure that the king is slightly safer and slightly better placed for an ending. Now, let's say the opponent plays king h8. They have nothing better than to wait. Then we can play rook a8, trade. There is a bit of pressure, right? This bishop is under attack. Then the king goes away, king goes back to defend, and now we can play a standard idea in this pawn structure, which is c4. The reason we play c4 is because after these pawns get traded, we have a pass pawn on the b file, and our opponent only has an extra pawn on d6, which is doing nothing. So this is a very one-sided battle. This pawn can basically advance, and there is really nothing that black can do in the meantime other than to wait. So this pawn will advance no matter what. For example, if you waited with a move like g6, have a fork. Obviously you're not going to do that, but you cannot move the king without losing this bishop. You cannot easily move the rook. There's not a lot of good squares. Let's say you waited with h5, I can play h4. you're running out of moves. And if you play rook a7, we can trade. And after b5, this pawn is just advancing and is going to promote relatively easily. Another possibility is, what if black played queen e6? Then there is no control of b5 anymore, so we could play b5 and then b6 and then maybe queen c8 or something like that, and we would be winning. But there is an even more direct continuation with queen a6, attacking the rook. Then after queen d7, we have rook takes f8, very clever move, giving up the exchange for a moment in order to play this check. And the only way to respond would be to play queen e8, and after queen b7 we are a piece up and we win the game. Now, I don't want you to be confused and think that this was some kind of a tactical accident or a little bit of luck for white. The reason that this tactic worked in the first place is because we had this powerful knight on d5, which was dominating the board, and it was far more effective than the very weak and useless bishop on f8. So as we go back, you can realize that white has been sort of winning all along. Now let's consider a different continuation. After we played before, there is two ways that black can play. Black can try to either hold the pawn on b5 or hold the pawn on a6. Both are bad, but we have to see both. So we have already seen what happens when black tries to protect the pawn on b5. Now let's say black plays rook a8, and then after a4, they try to hold the pawn on a6 instead. Then we have a different continuation. We will take and we will build pressure against the pawn on a6. And then when our opponent plays rook d a8, we have to be clever. We cannot push this pawn. Okay, so for example, if you played g3 and h6, and now you play the b5, that would be a mistake, because pawn takes, trade, and even though we are much better with white, this is not quite winning, because our extra pawn on c3 doesn't go anywhere, because it will be traded. So the way for us to win easily with white is to trade pawns the right way. So what we will do after some preparation is c4. You play c4, next move you play b5. So when your opponent takes, now you can trade, and then pawn takes. So instead of having a pawn stuck on c3, you have a pawn on b5 which is running and winning. The game here would be over in just a couple moves. For example, with queen b7, b6, queen c4, and queen c7. And your opponent can do nothing to really prevent the promotion of this pawn. So the game is over. Now, you can see a few canonical wins like this, examples that you can learn from, but the goal is that at the end of this whole exercise, you're able to go back to the original position and have a crystal clear understanding of the evaluation. You know the plans, you know how they play out, and you know that the overall evaluation is that white is winning here. What I want to do next is I want to make small adjustments to this position and discuss how the adjustments modify the evaluation. So let's move on to the next example. In this case, we have a bishop instead of a knight, and I will tell you right away that bishop is less powerful than knight in this kind of positions, but we are still winning. This is still extremely one-sided because the bishop on d5 is a monster, is extremely powerful, controls both sides of the board, while the bishop on e7 is still relatively useless. So we can play the same idea. In fact, we can still play b4 with the idea of playing a4 next. Now, if our opponent played a5, I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, but we're still going to touch all the main points. Let's say our opponent played a5, we can play a4. We don't mind trading pawns on the queen side as long as every line we calculate, we end up with a pass pawn. So for example, if our opponent takes, now we can play an intermediate move, a5. And after pawn takes, this is winning for white. You can review a little bit with the engine if you're not convinced, but effectively we are going to combine the invasion on the c file, with the pressure against the pawn on f7, with the weak pawn on b5, with the passed pawn on the a file, and the combination of all those things should be enough to win. Now, let's go back. Let's say your opponent took on a4. We recapture, opponent takes, and now you might ask yourself, should I take with the rook or with the pawn? Well, if you take with the rook, your pawn on c3 is not doing much. So you definitely should take with the pawn. And now again, you have a pass pawn on the b file, and we already know that this is kind of a winning setup. Now here the game could have continued with rook c7, g3, just to eliminate back rank ideas, right? And then b5. Our goal is to advance this pawn very simply. So we want to play rook a6, b6, that should be winning. Now let's say our opponent plays rook b8, we play rook b1, again we are threatening this move. And now our opponent plays rook a7. This is like the only idea to stop the pawn from advancing. Now I would like to play something like rook a6 so that I can advance my pawn, but unfortunately my rook is hanging, so I cannot do that. Instead, I can play rook c4, trying the same idea again. I want to play rook c6 to lift the blocker so that my pawn can advance. And then if my opponent plays rook c7, I have a very interesting continuation with take, take, and queen f3. I'm threatening to capture. How can this pawn be protected? If we protect the pawn with the rook, then we can play b6 and b7, and this is kind of a win for white. Now, let's say that instead, black played bishop f8, protecting the pawn for now. Now we can exploit the fact that we have two weaknesses and we are playing on both sides. So we can play the clever b6. So we play b6, we attack this queen, and we exploit the fact that the queen is overloaded, protecting both objectives. So when black takes on b6, we can just take, we can take, and we can deliver a checkmate next move. Now, the other possibility is that after we play b6, the opponent will play queen e7, and this is obviously a win for white. Let's just see one possibility. We could play king g2, h4. It's not necessarily I'm going to play h5, because I don't want to weaken my dark squares unnecessarily. I'm just making a useful move. h4, h5, we can play queen a3. I'm kind of preparing to go something like queen a7 in some lines. And then, well, queen a7, we are attacking on f7. It's almost a checkmate threat. And when our opponent covers, honestly, we have a lot of winning ways. We could just push and then try to find a way to break through. But here's a very effective way. We could play rook c1. Our opponent cannot take the pawn because we play rook c7. And now two pieces are hanging and the game is lost. So instead, our opponent may try to defend with king f8. And after rook c7, this is kind of a win, right? We are attacking the bishop, we are attacking the pawn. The game is basically over. And here we can win tactically with rook takes e7 and queen takes b8. Again, this was winning all along. The tactics were just the mechanism to win, but this has been winning for a very long time because we have such an imbalanced control of the key squares of the game. In this case, the bishop on d5 was always so powerful and the bishop on e7 was always relatively useless. So another conclusion that you can reuse over and over, this is winning for white. Now, let's look at how we evaluate new positions. Let's say I give you this position. So you may look at this position and remember, wow, this is so similar to previous positions we've seen. I already know a game where white was winning, but now there is a little difference. The difference is that these pawns have been pushed to h3 and g4. So all you really need to do is know the previous position, remember the evaluation, and then understand who benefits from this variation, from these changes. And in this case, I hope you can realize that this advance can only benefit black because what we have done is we have created weaknesses on dark squares. So now this bishop, which was previously dead and neutralized, now has some things to do. Nothing too impressive, let's be honest. White is still better, but there is at least some counterplay. So the previous position was clear advantage, or actually it was decisive advantage for white. This is probably clear advantage for white. Still a big advantage. The bishop on d5 is still better, but at least black has some things to do. Let's go to the next one. So now, actually white's kingside is healthy again. There is no problems on the kingside. I can play just g3 and h4 and the bishop is completely under control. But the difference now is that the queenside is closed. What does that mean? If you remember the canonical examples where white was winning by invading on the queenside, that's not possible anymore, right? So previously we had this one-sided immediately winning advantage, We still have a one-sided advantage, but it is not so immediate anymore. There is no invasion. There is only one place that we can win now. We can only win on the kingside. So this position is perhaps somewhere between clear and even slight advantage for white, because there is just not enough places to create a decisive edge. Now there is one thing that I will tell you, is that even though white doesn't have as many winning plans, black has no winning plans. So in practice, I would still say that this is a clear advantage for white, just because psychologically it is so difficult to play this position with black when you know that you have nothing to aim for other than a draw. That's always a very difficult situation to be in. Let's move on to the next example. So now this is getting more interesting. So what this actually happens in many lines is that white is playing some kind of a English attack or some kind of a general attack on the king side, and they expand. But now the game became a lot more positional. So now actually with white, we wish we could unpush our pawn. We could bring this pawn from g5 back to g3. Now you might say, who benefits from the pawn being on g5? Black does, because now black has a break. Black can play something like rook f8 and f6, and there is pressure along the f file against the pawn on f2. This is an essential observation, and because of this game is perhaps the first time that black actually has winning ideas. Doesn't mean that black is better, white is still a little bit better, but black has ideas that could, if successful, give them an actual advantage, because white has a weakness that wasn't present in the previous examples we were familiar with. Now, the bishop, still strong, the pawn on d6 is still backward, but this pawn on g5 is basically a distraction. It makes it harder for you with white to focus on the queen side when you have such an open king side. That's all. Finally, let's see another variant. Let's say that now the bishops are missing. Now, this I would call an equal game. Why? Because the last advantage that white had left is gone. The bishop on d5 against the bad bishop, or the relatively limited bishop on e7. Now, there is still a backward pawn on d6, that's a weakness. But white also has their own problems, like the pawn on g5. So everything considered, this is nothing more than an equal game. Now, to close this video, I want to leave you with some exercises that you can use in order to put into practice the concepts that we've been discussing. I actually put these examples up in my own website, where you can find positions like the ones we discussed and a text box where you can enter your own thoughts. So the idea here is that you will summarize your own observations, tell me who is better and by how much. Maybe the question is telling you white is better, but you have to explain why. And then we'll use an AI-based system in order to read your response and then tell you which parts are right and which parts are wrong. It's kind of a live feedback mechanism that you can use to test whether you understood or you didn't, and exactly which point you understood and which one you did not. Now, I don't want you to feel bad if perhaps you enter some answers and they're only partially correct. That's very normal. These exercises are very open-ended, and even titled players struggle a little bit because not all of us think the same way, and sometimes we know the right answer, but we don't always know the right reasons. So that's not a big problem. So let's try this exercise really quick. I'm actually going to type my own thoughts myself. So here, I will say that, well, I mean, we already know this kind of position. This was actually from the first example, so I know that white is winning here. And the reason that we're winning is because we have, and then I'm going to maybe add some bullet points just so that we can really remember this. We have a strong knight on d5. And just to use kind of the right language and to really make sure we understand, I'm going to say that we have the knight on an outpost on d5. That's number one. Number two is that black has a bad bishop on e7, restricted by their own pawns, right? I mean, everyone knows this, but it doesn't hurt to really put into words everything that we understand, right? And then finally, I'm going to say that black has a backward pawn on d6, which can be attacked. And then finally, just to make sure that we really understand, you can always close by thinking, well, what is the final evaluation? I noticed that I already said that at the beginning, so I think this answer is good enough. So we can try to submit it. And by the way, I'm sorry if this is a little bit hard to read. I'll probably fix that tomorrow. But anyway, let's just submit this. And then let's see what does the AI system think about our answer. So in this case, we're kind of getting some live feedback right now. So we have to see which parts are right and which ones are wrong. They're getting highlighted automatically, right? So it says strong knight on d5, okay, very good. Backward pawn, and then, black's dark square bishop is passive and nearly useless, okay. Yeah, this is good. This is kind of very aligned with the overall expectation of this system. So it is correct. Partially it is correct because I think these are examples that I've selected myself and positions that I know very well. But as you go through all the exercises, you will see many which are perhaps a little bit more challenging. So let me show you another one which you may find a little bit more difficult. It is, well, this one is actually easy because you already know the answer to this, and I will let you try this as an exercise. But there is another one which is a little bit more tricky. It is this position. And actually for this, I've already answered it before, but let's try it again. So the title says, this position is nearly equal. Explain. So, as I said before, when we look at this position, we think about a similar position we know, and we try to identify the difference. The difference here is that the bishop is on e6 rather than e7, right? So if you remember, all of the previous wins and advantages were based on the fact that the bishop ended up stuck on f8 with nothing to do. Here, the bishop on e6, on the other hand, is ready to be traded on d5. So if I was playing with black, what I would probably do is either trade right now to eliminate this powerful knight on d5, or another approach is I can play something like rook c5 and then trade on d5 next move, so that white can't even put a piece on d5. So that's exactly what I'm going to say. So what I'm going to say is something like, the game is equal because the bishop can be easily traded for white's strong knight on d5. That's kind of the key point. And then maybe one little observation here is that we still have that pawn on d6, right? So I'm going to say the backward pawn on d6 is not vulnerable enough. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that yes, the pawn is backward, there's still an open file, right? But it's not such a big deal. This pawn can be protected. One weakness is typically not enough. How do I know that? A little bit of experience, to be very honest with you, right? And maybe finally I will close by saying that other sectors of the board are balanced. So neither side has major weaknesses. So I guess what I'm saying here is I understand that if you look at the kingside, there's nothing wrong with white's kingside. There's nothing wrong with black's kingside, right? The material is balanced, so I think everything is pretty clear, and there is no reason to think that white should have an advantage anymore. So let's submit this and get some feedback. Okay, so you see some of the answers getting highlighted, right? So the parts that are relevant. And then if there is anything I said which is like not relevant to the answer, it just will be ignored. So for example here, sectors of the board are balanced, okay, not highlighted because it's not important. But we got the key points correct, right? So white has a strong knight on d5, but it can be traded. And the backward pawn is not a serious problem. So that's it for today. I would encourage you to check out these exercises. There is about 100 already. Many of them are completely different positions. But now I hope that you have some of the tools that you need in order to assess some positions. And of course, feel free to leave any questions you have in the comments, such as if you find a position and you are not able to figure out the correct answer, or you want me to review it in a future video, just feel free to share it and I'll be happy to help you out. Thanks for watching. This channel is all about helping you learn and grow at chess. Hit like, subscribe, and join our Discord. It's full of learners just like you, who are discussing openings, puzzles, and new video ideas.